everyone, and I am Marie Walker, the director of the Ada May Ivester Education Center here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. And today I will be talking to you about the Palace of Versailles. Versailles is a place in France that has held the imagination of people for so long. And today we are going to be talking about not necessarily the people who lived and worked here, but the building itself. So not even just the grounds and the gardens, which I could go on for perhaps another live stream, but really today we're going to be talking about the building, the design, the architecture of Versailles. So the Palace of Versailles has been listed as a World Heritage Site for 30 years now and is one of the greatest achievements in French 17th century art and architecture. It has held sway in the public imagination for years because of its architectural grandeur and also its vast political history. But how did this palace come to be? Well, it was not always such a grand place. In 1623, King Louis XIII of France decided to build a hunting lodge near a village named, well, you guessed it, Versailles. The chosen site was on a hill on the king's favorite hunting grounds about 12 miles west of Paris, the capital of France. It was also just 10 miles away from his primary residence, the Chateau de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. In 1624, the king entrusted Jacques Le Mercier with the construction of a chateau on the chosen site. The Palace of Versailles never played the protective role of a medieval stronghold, and therefore it is not a castle. It is rather a chateau, which is a term that really began in the Renaissance period. The term chateau was used to refer to a rural location of a luxurious residence as opposed to a more urban palace. So sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Chateau de Versailles. And especially in those early days, it's not quite a palace yet. It's really more of a chateau. It was thus common to speak of the Louvre in Paris as a palace and the Chateau of Versailles out in what was then considered the country. Today, it has really grown to be an extension of Paris as the city has expanded. Now, the first chateau at Versailles was a small country residence, and according to one of the courtiers there, it was not a grand place by any sense of the imagination. This person said a mere gentleman would not have been overly proud of the construction. So it was not something fit for the King of France. It was barely fit for a mere gentleman, this early chateau at Versailles. But therefore, Louis XIII decided to rebuild his chateau at Versailles in 1631, and the reconstruction continued until 1634. This new chateau laid the basis of the Palace of Versailles as we know it today. The king also brought part of the fiefdom of Versailles in 1632. Now, a small chateau with a moat occupied this site until 1661, when the first work of expanding that chateau into a palace was carried out under the direction of King Louis XIV. The history of Versailles is intimately linked with the figure of Louis XIV, although the location existed, of course, for centuries before that sovereign. Louis XIV developed a genuine liking for Versailles early on in his life and decided to extend it beyond the chateau that had really grown out of that hunting lodge of brick and stone first built by his father. The king, who could see great things for the chateau and the forest around it, took on the role of architect himself. Of course, he also had architects help him in this, and built the masterpiece that is the Palace of Versailles, and it would forever be associated with him now. In 1651, Louis XIV made his first visit to Versailles, and about a decade later, he made the decision to enlarge his father's chateau into a palace, a task that he gave to architect Louis Laval. He was an architect that developed the French classical style in the 17th century. Louis XIV at first desired to preserve his father's chateau, and over the 1660s, he had Laval add only a forecourt paved in marble as seen in the picture next to me. and then also 2 detached service wings. But in mid-1669, however, Louis XIV decided to demolish the chateau and replace it with a palace that could house his household and government. But one of the king's officials objected strongly to this, and after actually arguing with the king, dissuaded him from demolishing the chateau, and the official royal residence then remained at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Instead, from 1668 to 1670, Laval encased Louis XIII's chateau on 3 sides in a feature dubbed the envelope, giving it a new, almost Italianate facade facing the gardens. But it also preserved the old marble court facade on the inside. Now, on the city side, Laval built symmetrical wings around the forecourt in the same style as the stables and servants' wings, but chose a white stone to cover the original palace on the garden side. The main floor, which is above the ground floor, so really the second story, we would call it in America, of this new palace, contained 2 symmetrical sets of apartments, one for the king and the other for the queen looking over the gardens. The 2 apartments were separated by a marble terrace overlooking the garden, with a fountain in the center. Each set of apartments was connected to the ground floor with a ceremonial stairway, and each had 7 rooms aligned in a row. Those rooms included a vestibule, a room for the guards, an antechamber, a chamber, a large cabinet or office, a smaller bedroom, and a smaller cabinet. The courtyard side of the palace followed the French aesthetic of a slate roof, but the new construction that Laval preferred was the Italian-style roofs that were hidden behind a balustrade decorated with trophies and pots de feu. But this envelope, well, had mixed reviews. It resulted in what was a mix of styles and materials that really dismayed Louis XIV, and it was described as a patchwork of buildings and styles. There were attempts to reconcile these different styles between these. Really, you have 2 facades, the inside and the outside, which are rather completely different styles, which any attempts to reconcile them truly did not work. It rather failed. Now, the interior of Versailles and its decoration was assigned to Charles Lebrun. Lebrun supervised the work of a large group of sculptors and painters called the Petite Académie, who crafted and painted the ornate walls and ceilings. In the 1670s and 1680s, 10 million livres worth of solid silver furniture was commissioned and designed by Lebrun, including tubs for Louis XIV's orange trees, an 8-foot-high sculpted throne, and a silver balustrade in the Salon of Mercury. But these items were actually melted down in 1689 to contribute to the cost of fighting the 9 Years' War, and do not survive. Lebrun also supervised the design and installation of countless statues in the gardens of Versailles. The grand stairway to the king's apartment was redecorated almost as soon as it was completed with plaques of colored marbles and trophies of arms, tapestries, balconies, and so the members of court could observe the processions of the king, which was also, of course, decorated by Lebrun. Now, the king increasingly spent his days at Versailles, and the government, court, and courtiers, numbering 6,000 to 7,000 persons, crowded into the buildings. The king ordered a further enlargement of Versailles, which he entrusted to the young architect Jules Hardin Mansart. Now, Mansart was Louis XIV's favorite architect, who actually came from a family of architects, and why he has the hyphenated last name with Mansart. Because you probably think of this roof when you think of France, that slightly, it is a slanted roof where it looks almost like there's a floor in it as well, that the roof is encapsulating the top floor, that was designed by Mansart. So he is honoring his own legacy with his hyphenated last name. And he continues his family's legacies of fantastic architecture. As I said, he was Louis XIV's favorite architect and the man behind most of the famous architectural creations of the king's reign. And he was an icon of French classicism during the late 17th century. It was truly Mansart who was the architectural genius behind the most spectacular constructions under Louis XIV. When we think of Versailles today, at least myself, I generally think of the Hall of Mirrors. Now, the Hall of Mirrors is a grand Baroque style gallery, and this grandiose ensemble of the hall and its adjoining salons was intended to illustrate the power of the absolutism of the monarch, located on the ground floor of the palace's central body. It faces west towards the palace gardens. Now, his work at Versailles include, well, of course, the Hall of Mirrors, but also the north and south wings, the great and small stables, the orangery, the Grand Commune, the Royal Chapel, and the Grove of the Dome, as well as the Colonnade Grove, the Grand Trianon, and the Notre Dame Church, and the Recollects Convent. So quite the auditions. Now, after this enlargement in 1682, Louis XIV was able to proclaim Versailles as his principal residence, and the seat of government was able to give rooms in the palace to almost all of his courtiers. But the renovations were still not done. After the death of Maria Theresa of Spain in 1683, Louis XIV undertook the enlargement and remodeling of the royal apartments in the original part of the palace. So that part that we talked about way back in the beginning of this presentation, that old chateau that his father had built, well, he is remodeling the inside of that now. And by doing this, he moved the king's chambers to the middle of Versailles in 1701, further illustrating how he was the center of the state, that he was the sun around which the country turned. Louis XIV's bedroom was built on the upper floor and was located centrally along the east and west axis of the palace. It was the most important room in the palace and was the location of two important ceremonies, where the king would wake up and go to sleep, surrounded by his courtiers. The king also had a ceremony for putting on and taking off his hunting boots, but we won't get into that today. So, of course, the bedroom not only had to accommodate the king and his bed, but also had to be large enough for all of the courtiers to stand in, to watch him rise, and then they would help him get dressed. What piece of clothing that you were allowed to put on the king was a display of your status in the royal court. And then again, of course, at night, the court, all of the gentlemen in the court, that is, would come and would help him disrobe and change into his sleeping garments, and then wish him a good night, and then leave. And of course, the same thing would happen with the queen, with all of the female attendants at the court. So this golden fence, almost, I might call it, is not there because it is a museum and you shouldn't get too close to the bed. I do believe that it was there to keep the courtiers from, rushing the bed. Now, this is his private chamber. Of course, the private chamber is not really that private and is located exactly in the middle of the palace, of course, demonstrating that, well, everything revolves around him. And therefore, the size and location of a room that a courtier was assigned in the palace depended on their rank and standing with the king. So if you have a room that is, of course, closer to the king's, well, the more favor that the king is bestowing upon you, the closer you are to the central runnings of the court. So it also was a status symbol of where your room was in Versailles. Now, King Louis XIV also instructed Mansart to begin the construction of the Royal Chapel of Versailles, which towered over the rest of the palace. But sadly, Mansart died in 1708, and so the chapel was completed by his assistant, Robert de Codet, in 1710. Versailles is a perfect example of what we could consider Baroque and Rococo architecture, but the French at the time would not have considered it to be Baroque because it is very different from the Italian Baroque style, which was considered to be like the Baroque style at the time. And of course, that Italianate Baroque style served as inspiration for many other European countries. Some art historians now call the style of the Louvre and Versailles French Classicism, or French Baroque, to distinguish the styles of the Baroque era, as the French Baroque architecture possesses somewhat different features than Italian Baroque architecture, including the emphasis on symbols of power and timeless domination. Other types of Baroque architecture feature symbolic art, but not necessarily with the emphasis of divine right, kingly power, and timeless rule, which was very important, very, very important to Louis XIV, as he called himself, and had others call him, the Sun King. This is the same man who said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. Baroque style is generally thought to be that architecture, or really style, as Baroque will apply to architecture as well as music and literature and other things developed in this time period. But for the sake of this, we'll be talking mainly about architecture. So Baroque style architecture is generally that relating to or denoting a style of European architecture, music, or art of the 17th and 18th centuries that followed mannerisms and is characterized by ornate detail. Baroque is characterized by extravagance in architecture, literature, and music, and was a way of thinking that encouraged artisans to diversify decorative elements such as gilding, stucco, arabesques, painted vaults, and trompe-l'oeil, which means to fool the eye. Therefore, it's really an optical illusion of architecture, if you will. All of these elements are evident in Versailles, and the palace can certainly be described as opulent and ornate. And also, everything in Versailles, in the Versailles of Louis XIV specifically, had a symbolic meaning. It was put there with purpose. The ceilings are adorned with illustrations of Roman gods and goddesses, with Louis XIV, well, he's painted as Apollo, the sun god, for who he had great affinity and modeled himself after. Throughout the palace, you will find the intertwining L's of his name, as it serves as a constant reminder that he is the king and all power comes from him by the grace of God. Now, following the death of Louis XIV in September of 1715, the court abandoned Versailles and transplanted itself briefly to Paris the following December. Versailles then entered a long period of neglect, but the governor of the estate ensured that the fountain displays were activated every fortnight to keep them in working order. Now, Louis XV then became king, and during his reign, the palace underwent major work both inside and outside, including full refurbishments of his apartments, demolition of the ambassador staircase, and the construction of the large theater, the Royal Opera House, which had been started by Louis XIV, but was not completed until the reign of Louis XV. Now, the Opéra Royal was designed by Ange-Jacques Gabriel, and it was first used on May 16, 1770, for the marriage of the dauphin, later Louis XVI, and Marie-Antoinette. which was one of the greatest events to take place in Versailles in the late 18th century. The opera contained a mechanism that allowed the orchestra level to be raised to the stage, which also allowed it to be used for dancing and banqueting. It was noted that when the opera opened, it required 3,000 candles to be burned for opening night. Now, though it is lovely and lavish, this opera house was actually rarely used due to its cost of just putting on a production. Candles are expensive, as well as performers. And since it was so expensive and France's finances were getting pretty bad towards the end of the 1700s, it was, well, sadly, rarely used. It was at Versailles that there was an attempted assassination on Louis XV's life, and also in 1757, that is where Mozart performed as a child prodigy. But when the king began suffering from what seemed to be the first symptoms of smallpox in Trianon, Louis XV was immediately moved to Versailles, where he died on the 10th of May, 1774, making Louis XVI king. Louis XVI was actually born at Versailles, just like his grandfather, and he actually became king before the age of 20. While devoting himself mostly in his private chambers to studying various sciences that he particularly liked. He was also very fond of his wife, Marie-Antoinette, and in 1774, he offered her the Petit Trianon, built by Louis XV for Madame de Pompadour, but it was first inlived by Madame du Barry. Now, Marie-Antoinette made the Petit Trianon her private domain, and she built a number of structures, including a working farm, also called the Hamlet, which provided the palace with fresh produce. There was also a nearby house and a small theater that she enjoyed on this estate associated with Versailles. She also built the Temple of Love, which modern-day curators say can be seen from her room in the Petit Trianon, which is a smaller house, if you will. Still quite lavish, but smaller than Versailles. And it features a dome propped up by nearly a dozen columns covering a statue, which shows a depiction of Cupid cutting his bow from the club of Hercules. Additionally, she built the charming grotto, which is a cave that had a moss bed for her to lie on. It also had 2 entrances, prompting much speculation as to what went on in it. Now, though Marie-Antoinette is known for her lavishness, and Versailles is also known for its lavishness, in reality, it seems that she did not always enjoy being queen and the pressures that put upon her, as her escape, really, this estate that is really truly escapism, reflects a desire for a simpler life and perhaps a homesickness for her native Austria. Now, of course, it is generally well known that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were the last king and queen of France before the French Revolution. They failed to see clearly the social and economic situation that their country found itself in, and they were forced to leave Versailles for good on the 6th of October, 1789. Now, far from having been pillaged by a rampant mob, as might be imagined, the Palace of Versailles actually came through the period of the French Revolution relatively unscathed, even though some would not have minded seeing such a key symbol of the monarchy system laid to waste. But in August of 1793, the Central Museum for the Arts opened, well, in Paris, to the detriment of Versailles, because the initial stock of this museum came from collections of painting and sculptures that belonged to the crown and had been at Versailles, at least some of them. But in another development, there was a law passed on the 10th of June, 1793, that said the disposal of all of the contents of the former palaces of the crown, apart from works of art and science, was called for. So therefore, all of the furniture and furnishings concerned that had not accompanied the royal family to Paris or had not been sent to the furniture storehouse or requisitioned for various services were sold off over the course of almost a year between August of 1793 and August of 1794. So about 17,000 items were on offer and bought, the vast majority of which were acquired by Paris merchants and citizens. Now, although the furniture and many of the works of art had been removed from the palace continued to be an attraction, with guided tours still being organized in the late 1700s. In many cases, it was not totally deserted by any means of the imaginations, because in 1793 it was designated as a public repository, or a place for storing and sorting all these items confiscated during the Revolution, whether from migrants, convicts, or religious institutions. The new regime had a lot of things, and they weren't sure where to put them, so Versailles seemed like a good place. And it was on the basis of these seizures of items and, well, whatever had not been taken from the palace already, that the project was launched in 1794 to establish a museum at Versailles, which, after a somewhat chaotic installation period, opened in 1796. There was a science room covering natural history and physical sciences that was set up on the ground floor of the North Wing, while a library was established on the ground floor of the South Wing. The state apartments and the Queen's apartments were used to display paintings as well as vases and other collectibles, which were placed on those marble-top tables. And this last section, it underwent considerable change, becoming in 1797 the Special Museum of the French School, which was dedicated solely to French painters past and present. It entailed a further exchange of works of art between the Paris museums and Versailles, with the latter having to relinquish paintings and antiques it still held from foreign schools in return for paintings and sculpture by French artists. Now, this museum was short-lived. It opened in 1801 and then closed its door again in 1803, but it helped make the connection between the paintings hanging on the walls and the paintings on the ceilings in the apartments. Now, well aware of the palace's image as just a complete symbol of monarchy, Napoleon, who came to power, chose not to settle and not to make Versailles his home. He instead opted for Trianon, which was a little more modest, but still very well-to-do. It just did not have the image of the monarchy that Versailles did. It was not really until the ascension to the throne of Louis Philippe, or the King of the French, in 1830 that Versailles was really brought back to life. Like the members of his family, the Orleans, the new sovereign of the July monarchy was keenly interested in history, and by deciding in 1833, he also created a museum at Versailles, which this one was dedicated to all the glories of France. And therefore at Versailles, the monarch sought to reforge a bond among the French people, from the legitimate monarchists to the revolutionaries, and from the supporters of Napoleon to the liberals at this place. And it opened in 1837. This museum celebrated the glorious events in French history from the Middle Ages to the start of the July monarchy, also helping establish this king's claim to, well, be in power. Now, in the late 1800s, Pierre de Nolloc began to restore Versailles' character as a royal residence and to recognize the collection of Louis Philippe's museum and to reorganize those collections as well. But during the horrors of the First World War, Versailles suffered anew, but the palace, well, it was forced to close and its works had to be protected. But like Paris, Versailles was not invaded, and all in all, life rather continued, even though at a slower pace. And the museum's collections grew and visitors arrived, though fewer than before. And the palace spent the warriors mobilizing support for the national effort and assisting the wounded and the families of soldiers as much as possible. And then it was chosen for the signing of the peace treaty to end World War I in 1919. And the eyes of the world once again turned to Versailles, and it became the center of the world's attention. But through the war and the years before and after, Versailles had begun to show its age at this time, and it needed costly repairs. And in an interesting turn of events, salvation for Versailles came from across the Atlantic in the person of billionaire John D. Rockefeller, who made 2 enormous donations to the palace for its restoration, recalling the involvement of France in the American War of Independence. The wealthy businessman inaugurated a custom of philanthropy and patronage that became indispensable for the proper functioning and restoration of the sites at Versailles. Now, all kinds of major exhibitions and guided tours are available to visitors at the Palace of Versailles, and during their journey of discovery through this major historical site, people have come to discover a love of history and interest in French politics and how that played out truly here at the court of Versailles. Now, all kinds of major exhibitions and guided tours are available at the Palace of Versailles, as visitors are welcome to come and discover this palace for themselves and have a journey of discovery through this major historical site. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you learned something interesting about the Palace of Versailles. Sometimes we focus on people, but today we focused on a place, as the Palace of Versailles truly is its own character that was there during so many historical events and continues to be a very fascinating and still rather relevant place to us today. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you will join us next time at the Northeast Georgia History Center. Take care.